There is a quiet ache that arrives before any great becoming. It doesn't come with fanfare or clarity. It often begins with the soft collapse of what once made sense. The life you built so carefully, the roles you wore like armor, the dreams you worked so hard to shape, they begin to loosen. And it feels like something is wrong. But deep down, some part of you knows, this is not the end. This is the summons. At first, you might resist. You tell yourself to try harder, to hold it all together, to keep performing the version of yourself that made people stay, that made the world applaud. But the applause begins to sound hollow. The mirrors no longer reflect someone you recognize, and so, quietly, reluctantly, you start to let go. This is the moment the old self begins to fall apart, not because you failed, but because you've outgrown its scaffolding. What looked like breakdown is actually breakthrough. The disorientation is not dysfunction. It's the fertile disintegration that precedes soul formation. You begin to notice what you used to ignore, the longings you buried, the questions you silenced, the truths that once felt too disruptive to name. They surface not to destroy your life, but to bring you back to it. And the pain? It is not punishment. It is presence. A sharp divine presence pointing you inward. It's here you realize you are not a problem to solve. You are a mystery to live. And mysteries don't offer solutions, they offer invitations. Invitations to feel, to descend, to witness yourself in your rawest, most unmasked form. You stop trying to be impressive, you start becoming real. This moment, this sacred unraveling, is the beginning of a deeper kind of wisdom. Not the kind you read in books or recite in circles, but the kind that emerges when you sit in the fire of your own undoing and choose not to run. When you let things ache. When you stop demanding that healing be tidy. You don't yet know what's on the other side, but you're learning to stay. You're learning that maybe your value doesn't come from your productivity, your achievements, or how well you perform ease. Maybe your value is woven into your breath. Maybe your worth is the way you are willing to be here, open, honest, unfinished. And so the unraveling continues, not as a crisis, but as an invitation. Each unraveling thread is a question. What is truly mine? What have I been carrying that no longer fits the shape of who I'm becoming? These questions do not demand immediate answers. They require reverence. They ask you to slow down, to notice the tremble beneath your practiced smile, to honor the voice within that has waited patiently for your attention. You begin to understand that true transformation is not about changing into someone else. It's about peeling back the noise, the conditioning, the fear, until what remains is the quiet power of who you've always been. That person doesn't chase clarity, they carry it. That person doesn't beg for love, they become it. That person doesn't mask their mess, they bless it. This is the sacred unraveling, the holy returning, the real beginning. There is a kind of grief that goes unspoken, the grief of spending years trying to edit yourself into someone lovable. You try to optimize your personality, minimize your emotions, regulate your expression, not out of authenticity, but out of fear. You smile when you want to scream. You nod when your soul begs to say no. You master the performance of likability while a silent erosion happens inside, an erosion of your own belonging to yourself. And you don't even realize it at first, because the applause masks the ache. The praise sounds like safety, until one day, it doesn't. Until one day you wake up and realize you've become fluent in everyone else's expectations, but illiterate in your own truth. That's when something ancient in you begins to stir. Not the voice that says, be better, but the one that says, come back. Come back to the messy, sacred, untamable aliveness of your being. Come back to the parts of you that you've labeled too much, too sensitive, too wild, too contradictory. These parts don't need to be edited. They need to be witnessed, not fixed, felt. They are not obstacles to wholeness, they are gateways. When you allow them space to breathe, something miraculous happens. You begin to belong to yourself again. But this reclamation is not clean, it's not pretty, it's not a montage of journal entries and meditations leading to instant peace. It's awkward, it's raw, it's deeply disorienting. Because for so long, your compass was external. What do they think? Will this be accepted? Is this version of me digestible? And now, you're being asked to shift the source of truth from their gaze to your gut. You're being asked to build a new way of being, one where worth is not a verdict you earn, but a frequency you return to. over and over, especially when it's hard. This is where the soul begins to break through the surface, not in declarations, but in moments. The moment you say no and don't explain it, the moment you cry and don't apologize, the moment you rest without guilt, create without comparison, breathe without performance. These are not small acts, these are revolutions. Acts of remembrance that say, I was never a problem to solve, I was always a mystery to live. And mysteries cannot be rushed, they cannot be crammed into clarity, they unfold in the sacred tempo of presence. They ask for listening, for surrender, for your willingness to feel what you've tried so hard to outthink. This is not regression, it's return, not to the person you were, but to the self you've always been underneath the noise, beneath the perfection, waiting patiently to be remembered. Sometimes healing doesn't look like rising, it looks like sinking, not into despair, but into depth, into the ocean floor of your being, where truths long silenced are still whispering. You descend not to disappear, but to touch what has gone untouched. You begin to realize the answers you've been searching for do not live in books or blueprints, they live in the body, in the breath, in the quiver behind your chest when something real stirs. This descent is not a flaw in your growth, it is the very gateway to it. You are not backsliding, you are deepening. What appears like unraveling is often the soul's most honest attempt at liberation. The mind wants solutions, the soul wants sensation. The mind says, fix this discomfort. The soul says, feel it. And this shift from fixing to feeling changes everything. You begin to move differently in the world, less out of reaction, more from remembrance. You don't always know what you're becoming, but you trust the undoing. You learn to welcome the pauses. You learn to honor the tremble. You recognize that sometimes a breakdown is not a collapse, but a clearing, a necessary earthquake so the truth can finally have space to stand. And what is that truth? That you were never broken, that your wounds do not make you unworthy, they make you woven, threaded with the complexity of being alive, of loving, of losing, of longing. You stop pathologizing your pain and start understanding it as sacred. You stop asking, what's wrong with me, and start wondering, what is this pain asking me to see? The shift is subtle, but seismic. You're no longer asking life to give you control. You're asking it to teach you how to feel safe without it. You're learning to trust, not in the plan, but in your presence. And in that presence, you stop clinging to who you were and start listening to what is emerging. There is no roadmap for this, no checklist, no 10-step guide, only a daily returning, a soft yes to what's here, a quiet courage to stay, even when it aches, even when the old strategies call you back. Because now you know, comfort without truth is not peace, it's paralysis. And you want more than comfort, you want aliveness, you want wholeness. You want truth, even if it undoes you. And so you let it. You let it undo the performance. You let it dismantle the masks. You let it dissolve the illusion that you must be perfect to be loved. You let it bring you back not to safety as the world defines it, but to the safety of your own sacred self. Unpolished, unrushed, and finally, undeniable. There is something holy about no longer running from yourself. Something deeply sacred about sitting with your ache and not trying to numb it, name it, or negotiate it away. You realize that not everything inside you is a problem to be solved. Some things are simply meant to be witnessed. Some storms are not meant to be tamed, but understood. And in that understanding, a space opens. Not to fix, but to feel. Not to conquer, but to connect. You've spent years trying to becoming good, becoming valuable, becoming enough. And now, something ancient in you rebels. A deeper knowing whispers, you already are. This whisper doesn't come from the mind, it comes from the marrow. It doesn't argue, it remembers. It remembers the part of you that existed before you were taught to perform, before the world told you who you should be, before love became conditional and silence became survival. This remembering is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is not for show. It happens in the small, tender moments, in the breath you take before reacting, in the tear you let fall without shame, in the space you give yourself when no one else can. This is how you begin to reclaim your life, not all at once, but in pieces. And each piece, no matter how fragmented, holds a clue to your wholeness. You begin to see your triggers not as failures, but as invitations to meet the younger versions of yourself still living inside. the angry one, the fearful one, the one who never felt chosen. You don't silence them anymore. You hold them. You ask what they need, and in that holding, healing begins. Not because the pain vanishes, but because it is no longer carrying the weight alone. This is the heart of inner work. Not to become someone else, but to come home to yourself. To sit at the table with every part of you and say, "You're welcome here." Not just the polished parts, not just the parts that earn praise, but the wild parts, the tender ones, the shamed and silenced and scared ones. You bring them home not through force, but through compassion. And in doing so, you become whole, not because you're healed, but because you're honest. This honesty doesn't always feel good. Sometimes it breaks you open. Sometimes it asks you to walk away from what once defined you. Sometimes it means disappointing others so you no longer abandon yourself. But even when it costs you comfort, it gives you truth. And truth, once felt, is something you can never unfeel. You begin to live not for applause, but for alignment. Not to be seen, but to be real. And in this sacred shift, quiet, slow, unwavering, you realize that your life is not something to manage, but something to feel deeply, to honor gently, to live fully, as the mystery it was always meant to be. There's a kind of wisdom that can only be born in silence, not the silence you impose, but the one that arises when you finally stop performing. When you pause long enough to feel what's beneath the need to explain, the urge to convince, the habit of shrinking. It is in this stillness that you begin to hear the truer voice, not the loud one of fear or the rehearsed one of pleasing, but the quiet hum of who you were before the world got to you. That hum doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply waits, patient, ancient. It has never doubted your worth, never bargained your being for belonging. It carries no checklist, no timeline, no measuring stick, only presence, only breath. And when you attune to it, even for a moment, you feel something shift. Not dramatically, but deeply. You stop looking outside for the next validation hit. You stop believing that someone else has the map. Because the map is you. The paradox of awakening is that it doesn't make you more. It makes you softer, quieter, more honest. You don't become someone others admire. You become someone you can finally sit with. And that becomes enough. Not because you've given up, but because you've come home. This kind of coming home can't be captured in a highlight reel. It won't get a standing ovation, but it will give you back your life. And once you've tasted that, performance feels hollow. You notice how much of your life was lived in response, responding to expectations, to disapproval, to the imagined gaze of others. You notice how often you've shape-shifted to stay safe, how rarely you've spoken from your gut, and instead of blaming yourself, you grieve. You mourn the years you abandoned your own voice. You hold that grief like a prayer. Because grief, when honored, becomes grace. Grace does not arrive to perfect you. It arrives to soften the parts of you hardened by survival. It does not erase the past, it embraces it. It holds your hand not to pull you forward, but to remind you that you've already made it through. And that alone is holy. So you begin to rewrite your story, not with grand declarations, but with small truths. You rest when you're tired. You speak when it matters. You let yourself be seen, not all at once, but more than before. You stop performing courage and start practicing trust. And slowly, your life begins to feel less like a performance and more like a prayer. Because in the end, your sacred work was never to be understood, it was to be embodied. Not to make yourself digestible, but to make yourself whole. Not to be perfect, but to be real. And from that realness, everything that truly matters begins to bloom. There is a moment in every healing journey when you no longer crave intensity, you crave integration. You've already cracked open, already done the deep dives, the breakthroughs, the catharsis, and now, what your soul longs for is steadiness. The gentle kind of healing that isn't loud or dramatic, but consistent. You begin to understand that true transformation doesn't always look like fire, sometimes it looks like water. Like the way rivers shape canyons over time. Not by force, but by flow. You realize you don't have to keep breaking in order to grow. You don't have to chase your wounds into every dark corridor of your psyche. You don't have to prove your readiness by how much you're willing to suffer. You've suffered enough. Now is the time to live differently. To practice the healing you once only theorized. To embody the softness you once believed was weakness. and to trust that gentleness is a strength that doesn't need to shout to be real. The world may not reward this kind of growth. It won't come with applause, but it will come with breath, with the ability to stay in your body when things get hard, with the courage to pause before reacting, with the wisdom to choose peace over performance. And in these small, invisible ways, you begin to feel the ground beneath you shift. Not because life got easier, but because you got rooted. You don't need to be loud to be powerful. You don't need to be fearless to be free. You don't need to be perfect to be loved. You only need to be present. And presence, you've learned, isn't something you chase. It's something you return to, again and again. Not as a destination, but as a devotion. And in that devotion, you find yourself becoming more available to life, to beauty, to joy, to connection that doesn't require masks. You start showing up as you are, not as who you think you should be. You start telling the truth not to be brave, but because anything else feels hollow. You start honoring your limits not as barriers, but as bridges to deeper self-trust. This is what it means to be whole. Not that you've finished healing, but that you no longer shame the parts that still ache. You offer them a seat at your table. You stop rushing them to be okay. You let them be seen, be heard, be held. And in doing so, you become someone who can hold others, not with answers, but with presence. Because the deepest kind of healing was never about fixing yourself, it was about loving yourself into freedom. And that kind of love changes everything, quietly, from the inside out. Eventually, you begin to see that the pain was never trying to punish you, it was trying to reveal you. It wasn't there to shame you, but to initiate you into a deeper intimacy with life. Every time you cracked open, it wasn't because you were weak, it was because your truth had outgrown its container. And what spilled out was never a mess, it was an unspoken need, a forgotten dream, a buried self coming back into the light. You stopped fearing your unraveling. You stopped seeing breakdowns as failure. You learned to hold space for your own undoing. Because now you know, healing doesn't always look graceful. Sometimes it looks like crying on the kitchen floor. Sometimes it looks like saying no with a shaking voice. Sometimes it looks like resting when the world tells you to push through. And none of that makes you less. It makes you real. You start trusting the pace of your soul. You stop measuring your worth by your output. You begin to honor the seasons of your being, the winters of stillness, the springs of renewal, the summers of expression, the autumns of letting go. You understand now that life is cyclical, not linear, that your growth isn't a straight line up, but a spiral inward. This spiral takes you deeper, not farther. It teaches you how to meet yourself again and again at different levels of awareness. You revisit old wounds, not because you've regressed, but because you're now strong enough to meet them with more compassion. You discover that returning is not failure, it's fidelity, a commitment to never abandon yourself, no matter how many times it takes. And in that fidelity, you become trustworthy to your own nervous system. You stop overriding your intuition, you stop gaslighting your instincts, you stop silencing the parts of you that once felt inconvenient. You give yourself the very things you've always needed: patience, safety, tenderness. And from that internal generosity, a new foundation is born. You stop asking others to save you, not because you no longer believe in help, but because you've learned how to co-create safety within. You become less reactive, more reflective, less performative, more present, less addicted to being understood, more committed to understanding yourself. The emptiness that used to echo now feels sacred, a space you tend to like a temple, not fill like a void. This is how you begin to live not from strategy, but from essence. Not from control, but from communion. Not from a need to prove, but from a willingness to be. And that willingness, simple and quiet, is what begins to change everything. There comes a moment when you stop waiting for the world to hand you permission to exist. You stop looking outward for validation, for some authority to say, yes, you are allowed to feel this, to want this, to be this. You realize that the only person who ever needed to believe in your right to wholeness was you. And in that realization, something ancient shifts like a door unlocking inside your ribcage. The part of you that always knew, but was taught to forget, finally exhales. You begin to see all the ways you've edited yourself for comfort, not your own, but someone else's. How many times you made yourself smaller so others wouldn't feel insecure? How often you swallowed your truth because the room didn't have the emotional bandwidth to hold it? How deeply you learned to betray your own intuition just to remain lovable in a world addicted to surface. But now, you choose differently. Not with rage, not with a performance of defiance, but with quiet devotion. You begin to stay with yourself in moments where you used to flee. You notice the urge to abandon, to fawn, to fix, and you pause. You breathe. You remember, this is not the time to be palatable. This is the time to be present. And so, you choose presence, even when it trembles. Being real is rarely glamorous. It's rarely applauded. It's messy, vulnerable, and often misunderstood. But it is also sacred, because in that authenticity, you begin to find your own pulse again. You stop performing intimacy and start cultivating it. You stop chasing safety through approval and start building safety through self-honesty. The moment you stop negotiating your essence is the moment you begin returning home. And home doesn't mean perfection. It means belonging to yourself, first and foremost. It means you don't need to rehearse your emotions before expressing them. You don't need to translate your pain into poetic metaphors just so it sounds acceptable. You don't need to beautify your grief to make it digestible. You let it be. And in that letting, you free something sacred that had been buried under layers of performance for too long. You begin to trust your own rhythm, to stop forcing clarity in moments meant for mystery, to stop demanding conclusions from questions still ripening inside you. You honor your seasons, your cycles, your quiet. You let silence be enough. You let your own being raw, radiant, unrevised be the loudest statement you ever make. And that, right there, is the rebellion. The soft kind, the holy kind, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it has already returned to the truth. You are not a problem to solve. You are a mystery worthy of reverence. And mystery, when lived fully, becomes its own form of light. The world will try to convince you that you need to be understood to be worthy, that your story must be coherent, that your wounds must be explained, that your joy must be justified. But you begin to see through the illusion. Worth is not something to be earned through clarity, it is something to be remembered through embodiment. An embodiment doesn't always make sense. It doesn't always translate. It just is. You stop trying to be a walking explanation. You stop offering disclaimers before your truth. You no longer preface your emotions with apologies. You begin to live without the urge to be decoded. You speak, not to be validated, but to honor the voice within. And you realize some of the most powerful things you'll ever say won't be fully understood, and that's okay. Your life is not a slogan. Your being is not a campaign. You are not here to sell yourself. In this space, you reclaim what was once made invisible, the intuitive, the mysterious, the non-linear parts of you, the parts that feel deeply and move slowly, the parts that can't be scheduled into 5-year plans or polished into bullet points, the parts that are real, even when they're not productive, especially then. You understand now that value isn't in how much you produce, but in how much you presence. And that presence doesn't need to be loud. It doesn't need to be persuasive. It only needs to be true. You begin to walk through your life differently. You stop trying to win people over. You stop auditioning for belonging. You stop adjusting your radiance to fit someone else's dim room. Your frequency begins to self-select. Some will lean in, others will drift, and you let both happen without clinging or shrinking. There's a peace that comes when you no longer trade your authenticity for connection, a groundedness that settles in when you choose truth over harmony. Not to cause harm, but to stop harming yourself. You no longer sacrifice your needs to manage someone else's comfort. You no longer perform emotions you don't feel. You begin to honor the complexity of being alive, all the contradictions, all the paradoxes, and you allow them to breathe. This is not a performance. This is a practice, a remembering, a soft yet unshakable knowing that you do not need to be simplified to be sacred, that your mystery is not a flaw, it is the very language of your soul. And while the world may never fully understand you, it no longer has to, because you've stopped demanding comprehension from those who've never met themselves deeply. You have, and that's enough. At some point, your healing no longer feels like a project. It becomes a quiet rhythm, a slow, steady tuning to what is real inside you. You stop chasing breakthroughs and begin honoring small shifts. You stop craving transformation that is loud and visible, and you begin welcoming change that is invisible, intimate, and lasting. There is no announcement, no grand finale, only a deepening, a soft descent into your own wholeness. You begin to trust the subtle, how your body exhales more easily when you speak your truth, how your chest relaxes when you say no without guilt, how your breath deepens when you let yourself rest. You stop looking for the next teacher to save you, the next course to fix you, the next method to complete you. Not because learning isn't valuable, but because you finally understand the wisdom you were chasing was never outside of you. You begin to realize that many of the answers you sought were never meant to arrive through your intellect. They were meant to unfold through your embodiment, through your return to presence, through your capacity to feel without flinching, through your willingness to stay with what's uncomfortable until it reveals what it came to teach. You no longer rush discomfort out the door. You offer it a seat at your table. You listen, and in that listening, something sacred begins to bloom. A different kind of power. Not the kind that dominates or persuades, but the kind that simply is. The kind that comes from knowing you are home within yourself, even when the world is chaotic. The kind that doesn't shout for attention, but radiates through quiet integrity. You begin to walk with this power. You do not wield it, you inhabit it. People may not know how to name this change in you. They may say you've become softer, or stronger, or less available, or more grounded. And all of it is true, because you are no longer bending into shapes to be understood. You are no longer translating yourself for environments that never felt safe. You are no longer asking for permission to be your full self. This part of the journey doesn't come with applause. It comes with clarity, with freedom, with unshakable presence. It is the space where you stop trying to be impressive and start being real, where you let your joy be quiet and your boundaries be loud, where you let your healing be slow and your truth be sacred, and in that sacred slowness you find what the noise never gave you: peace. Not a peace that silences the world, but a peace that stays, no matter how loud it gets. There comes a day when you no longer flinch at your reflection, not the one in the mirror, but the one in your life. The way your days echo back the truth of your choices. The way your relationships mirror the state of your inner world. You stop resenting the reflection and start reading it with tenderness. You ask not, "What's wrong with me?" but "What is this trying to show me?" And that one shift changes everything. You begin to see your triggers not as signs of failure, but as invitations to presence. Your wounds not as evidence of brokenness, but as openings where more light can enter. You realize the stories you once told to protect yourself have expired. The mask no longer fits. The armor has grown heavy. And instead of reaching for new disguises, you begin to remove what no longer feels like you. It's not easy. It feels like standing naked in a room where everyone else is in costume. But the more you stand in your truth, the more you realize you were never meant to blend in. You were meant to awaken something forgotten, in others, in the collective, in yourself. And that awakening doesn't happen through performance, it happens through presence. You start creating not for applause, but because something real is moving through you. You speak not to impress, but to connect. You listen not to respond, but to understand. You let go of fixing people, and instead become a space where they remember how to return to themselves. You hold space for discomfort. You let silence be a teacher. You learn that love is not always loud. More importantly, you learn that you don't need to shrink yourself to make others comfortable. You no longer confuse compassion with self-abandonment. You can love and leave. You can forgive and still set boundaries. You can soften and still walk away. You stop playing roles that drain you and start embodying truths that nourish you. You stop proving. You start belonging to yourself. And in this belonging, you find a different kind of success. One not measured by accolades, but by alignment. Not defined by how many approve of you, but by how deeply you approve of yourself. You realize you don't need to be famous to be free. You don't need to be adored to feel worthy. You just need to live in integrity with your soul. And that is enough. There comes a moment in the journey where silence becomes more powerful than explanation, where you no longer reach outward to validate your experience. because you've finally turned inward to witness it. You stop asking the world to see your heart and begin the lifelong act of seeing it yourself. It's not that you no longer care, it's that your caring has deepened, matured, evolved. It is no longer a performance, it is a presence. No longer a plea, it is a peace. You begin to find a rare kind of safety, not in certainty, but in self-honesty. Not in being understood, but in being willing to stand in your truth, even when no one claps. You realize that self-abandonment was never a sustainable path to belonging. That the moments when you edited your voice to be loved were the very moments you drifted furthest from yourself. And now, you are returning, piece by piece, breath by breath, not to a perfect version of yourself, but to a truthful one. You stop needing healing to be visible in order for it to be real. You stop needing your boundaries to be accepted in order for them to be valid. You no longer carry the compulsion to explain your softness or justify your no. What used to feel like rebellion now feels like alignment. What used to feel like defiance now feels like devotion. Devotion to the deepest part of you that always knew the way home. This is not the kind of awakening that makes noise. It doesn't sparkle on stages. It doesn't trend on timelines. It's quiet, almost imperceptible. Like the way your breath slows when you no longer need to perform. Like the way your shoulders drop when you no longer brace for misunderstanding. Like the way you begin to speak less but mean more. In this stillness, you are no longer seeking to be impressive. You are seeking to be real. And that is the quietest, rarest kind of power. You understand now that becoming whole was never about becoming perfect. It was about remembering that nothing in you needed to be erased to be worthy. Not the anger, not the longing, not the mess, not the fire. You learned to carry all of it not as shameful baggage, but as sacred material, as the very texture of your humanity. You were never a puzzle to be solved. You were a poem raw, unfinished, wholly to be read slowly, to be lived fully, to be honored in your becoming. There comes a point in the journey when what once pushed you forward no longer moves you at all. The strategies, the seeking, the endless attempts to be more, feel more, achieve more, they begin to dissolve under the weight of a deeper longing. Not for expansion, but for return. Not to become someone else, but to come home to who you were before the striving began. This shift doesn't arrive with fireworks. It's subtle, like the quiet moment you stop chasing applause and realize you no longer need the noise to feel real. It's in the way you no longer fill the silence with justification. The way you start choosing rest over reaction, stillness over spectacle. You begin to notice how much of your suffering was rooted not in what happened to you, but in what you believed you had to become in response. The armor you wore so proudly now feels heavy. The roles you played to be palatable no longer fit. And beneath all of it, you sense something softer, a part of you that never needed to be fixed, only witnessed. You start listening to that part. At first, it speaks in whispers, a sigh when you overextend, a clench in your belly when you say yes but mean no, a quiet grief when you abandon yourself for approval. These are not inconveniences, they are invitations, each one calling you back to presence. You realize healing isn't a destination, it's a rhythm, a relationship, a remembering. It's less about doing and more about allowing, less about correcting and more about including. You no longer feel the urgency to transcend your humanity. Instead, you begin to honor it, to re-inhabit the body you once escaped, to breathe fully, to cry deeply, to laugh loudly, to feel the entire range of your existence without shame. And in this return, you discover a radical truth. Your wholeness was never dependent on your progress. It was in your presence all along. In this season, you stop measuring your worth by how much you produce, how spiritual you appear, or how unbothered you seem. You begin to trust your mess, your anger, your confusion, your longing. Not because they are problems to solve, but because they are portals, doorways into the parts of you still waiting to be loved. You make room for all of it, and something miraculous happens. You begin to soften, not as a performance, but as a state of being. You become less reactive, not because you're above pain, but because you're no longer afraid of it. You can sit with discomfort without abandoning yourself. That is the real gold. That is the sacred alchemy of being. You begin to feel your life from the inside out, not as a sequence of events to control, but as a field of energy to attune to. You no longer chase timing. You honor rhythm. You no longer force outcomes. You respond to invitations, gentle, subtle ones, that rise from the quiet knowing in your bones. Your nervous system becomes your compass. Your body becomes your oracle. And trust becomes less of a concept and more of a cellular memory. Not loud, not logical, but embodied. In this new way of living, you stop measuring your value by your output. You stop defining your worth by your productivity. You no longer calculate rest as a weakness or stillness as stagnation. Instead, you begin to see that some of the most radical acts are the ones no one sees. Letting yourself breathe when the world demands urgency. Walking away without drama. Saying no with grace. You learn to disappoint others before you betray yourself, not from cruelty, but from clarity. The world around you may still operate on speed and spectacle, but your inner world begins to hum with slowness and sovereignty. You are no longer trying to keep up. You are learning to drop out of the race altogether. Not because you failed, but because you finally see it was never your race to run. You are not here to win at the game of being more acceptable, more desirable, more successful. You are here to be free, and freedom has its own metrics. Peace, alignment, presence. The more you honor your truth, the less space there is for what isn't aligned. The more you listen, the more the noise outside loses its power. And what rises in its place is not silence, but music, the kind of music that only you can hear. The kind that doesn't seek applause. It simply echoes in your chest when you make choices from your soul instead of your wounds. That's the sound of coherence. That's the sound of home. And so you live differently now. Not perfectly, not painlessly, but more fully. You cry when the tears rise. You laugh when joy surprises you. You rest when your body asks. You no longer apologize for your humanity. You wear it like a prayer, sacred, fragile, and whole. There's nothing to fix. There's only more to feel, more to witness, more to remember. Because you are not a self-improvement project. You are not a checklist. You are not a brand. You are a mystery, pulsing, living, evolving. And your only job now is to stay close enough to yourself to not miss the miracle of becoming. You start to see how much of your life was spent performing safety, smiling when you were crumbling, nodding when your soul screamed no, adapting so quickly that you didn't even know it was survival. But now, something inside you pauses not in fear, but in presence. You notice the urge to please, and instead of following it blindly, you breathe. You ask yourself, is this love, or is this fear dressed up as belonging? You begin to choose again, not react, but respond. Your nervous system, once coiled like a spring, begins to unclench. Slowly, gently, like a fist learning it no longer needs to fight. And as it unravels, so do the stories. The ones that told you your worth was conditional, that your value came from usefulness, that your love had to be earned through performance. These narratives lose their grip not through argument, but through self-return. You no longer fight them. You no longer feed them. You simply stop identifying with them. In this soft rebellion, you become someone new, not by adding layers, but by shedding them. The polished version, the pleasing version, the perfect version, they all fall away. What's left is something raw, something tender, something exquisitely ordinary. And in that ordinariness, you find the divine. You realize your sacredness was never in your sparkle, but in your stillness, in your ability to be fully here without needing to earn your place. And when you look back not with regret, but with reverence, you see all the versions of yourself who tried, who hustled, who twisted and dimmed and overgave. You don't judge them, you thank them. They were never the problem. They were trying to keep you alive. But now, you are not just surviving, you are becoming. And they can rest. You no longer seek to be saved. You no longer wait for the moment when you'll finally be enough. You realize you've always been. Not because you checked all the boxes, but because you've returned to the mystery, the uncontainable aliveness of being human, the radical act of saying, I don't need to be fixed, I just need to be felt. And in that feeling, you begin to bloom. There comes a day when you stop looking for the answers and start listening for the questions. Not the ones that demand solutions, but the ones that open doors. What does it mean to feel at home in my own body? What would it look like to stop performing peace and actually live in it? What part of me have I never given permission to exist? These are not puzzles to be solved. they are invitations to presence. You realize the mind may never be satisfied, but the soul doesn't ask to be convinced. It asks to be witnessed. You stop intellectualizing your way through transformation. You drop into your breath, your belly, your bones. You start to feel the tremble in your chest, not as weakness, but as a threshold, a sacred doorway that opens every time you choose to stay with yourself instead of abandoning your discomfort. This is where the alchemy becomes embodied. You don't just know that you're enough, you begin to feel it, not as a mantra, but as a quiet truth in your cells. You don't need the universe to validate it with signs. You don't need strangers to applaud your growth. You don't even need to be seen. Because you are no longer seeking visibility, you are finally living in alignment. This shift doesn't happen in a flash of enlightenment. It happens in slow mornings where you let yourself rest, in long walks where no answers come, just breath, in lonely evenings where you choose not to numb, but to feel. It happens in your refusal to abandon yourself, even when the world gives you every reason to. That's the revolution, choosing presence over performance again and again, until presence becomes your home. And when that happens, even your pain transforms. It doesn't disappear, but it no longer defines you. It becomes part of your tapestry threads of shadow woven through your light. Not something to hide, but something that holds shape. You stop asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and begin to ask, "What wisdom did it leave behind?" You carry your grief not like a burden, but like a story that deserves to be told with dignity. There's nothing glamorous about this path. It's not photogenic, it doesn't trend, but it is holy, because it leads you back to the parts of yourself you once exiled. The messy parts, the tender parts, the parts that don't know the answers but still show up anyway. You no longer measure your worth in milestones. You no longer seek transformation as a trophy. You've begun to understand that your existence in its rawest, realest form is enough. This is not the end, but it is a return to the rhythm of your breath, to the pulse of your own truth, to the sacred ordinariness of being. You are no longer striving to be a better version. You are simply choosing to be here, fully. And that perhaps is the greatest miracle of all. Not becoming someone else, but finally daring to be exactly who you are. There is a quiet revolution in choosing wholeness over improvement, a radical act in a world that constantly sells you brokenness. You begin to see that healing is not about polishing yourself into acceptability. It's about reclaiming all the pieces you were told to suppress: the loud parts, the soft parts, the wild parts, the unsure parts, and bringing them back to the table. Not to fix them, but to welcome them home. You stop making your wounds your personality, but you also stop pretending they never happened. You create space for both the ache and the aliveness. You let your story breathe, not to be impressive, but to be honest. You realize the most magnetic people are not the ones who've figured everything out. They're the ones who've made peace with never needing to. The world taught you to compete, to climb, to constantly audit your value against others, but you've stepped out of that game now. You no longer chase proximity to power, applause, or perfection. You seek resonance. You seek truth. You walk away from rooms that demand you to dim, not because you're angry, but because you've remembered the cost of contorting yourself for love, and you've decided, never again. You are no longer asking for permission to rest, to speak, to not speak, to say "I don't know," to begin again. Your liberation lives in the simple things now: the deep inhale before a boundary, the silence after an honest no, the mornings when you choose gentleness over ambition. You start noticing how often you used to betray yourself for harmony, how often you equated safety with self-erasure. And you begin rewriting the story, one brave choice at a time. It's not always graceful. Sometimes it's clumsy and quiet and confusing, but it's yours. And that ownership is everything. You no longer outsource your power to teachers, titles, or timelines. You stop waiting for signs that it's safe to be yourself. You just are. And in that being vulnerable, raw, whole, you start living a life that's not just impressive on the outside, but nourishing on the inside. You realize now, you were never too much. You were never too soft. You were simply unedited. And in a world that profits off your self-doubt, that is revolutionary. To live unedited, to breathe as yourself, to belong to yourself first, and then let others meet you there not for who you pretend to be, but for who you've always been underneath the noise. The more you return to yourself, the less you fear being misunderstood. You no longer spend your energy trying to translate your soul for those unwilling to listen. You understand now that not everyone is meant to witness your unfolding. Some will misname your softness as weakness. Others will call your boundaries cold. But your worth was never up for debate. You are not here to be decoded. You are here to be. You begin to see clarity as a spiritual practice, a form of devotion. Not just knowing what you want, but knowing what you are no longer willing to tolerate. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop romanticizing chaos. You recognize that stillness is not stagnation, it's power rooted deep in the earth of your being. You don't argue with life as much anymore. You listen, you watch, you respond with care instead of reacting from fear. You notice how often you used to hustle for your own self-acceptance, trying to earn love by becoming someone else's idea of lovable. But now you stay, even when you feel messy, even when you feel uncertain. You stay because you've learned that healing happens not in your highlights, but in your willingness to be seen in your wholeness. This kind of peace doesn't shout. It doesn't need to prove anything. It simply is. You feel it in your spine, in the way your breath deepens, in the way your body stops bracing for impact. You are no longer at war with yourself, no longer slicing parts away to be more palatable, no longer negotiating your truth to maintain connection. If a relationship demands the death of your essence, it is not love, it is performance. You've stopped mistaking visibility for value. You've stopped trading authenticity for approval. You realize that the spotlight is often too bright to see yourself clearly, and sometimes it is the quiet places, the sacred pauses, the hidden corners where your soul comes alive. You trust the timing now. You trust your body. You trust that you don't need to rush toward healing, that healing arrives every time you choose not to abandon yourself. You are not an idea to be marketed, not a product to be perfected. You are a living, breathing miracle, not because you're flawless, but because you're real. And in a culture obsessed with optimization, that is sacred rebellion. To be here, as you are, without needing to be more or less or anything other than the truth of this moment. There comes a point when you stop searching for breakthroughs, for dramatic awakenings, for thunderclaps of clarity to announce your arrival. Instead, you begin to settle into the subtle magnificence of ordinary moments. You no longer chase the next version of yourself. You begin to cherish the one who has made it this far, the one who endured, the one who softened instead of hardened, the one who stayed. You start to realize that being alive, truly alive, doesn't require grand gestures. It requires presence. It asks you to show up not just when you're healed and whole, but also when you're hurting and unsure. Life invites you to bring your trembling, your rawness, your half-finished truths into the light. And in doing so, you discover that wholeness isn't a fixed state. It's a willingness to meet yourself again and again with open arms. The mystery of being is not something to be decoded. It is something to be honored. You are not a riddle waiting to be solved, but a poem unfolding with every breath. There is no final answer, no ultimate fix, no flawless destination. There is only depth. There is only the dance between light and shadow, silence and sound, movement and stillness, and the sacred act of remaining awake to it all. You become fluent in your own rhythms. You stop outsourcing your value to performance or productivity. You listen, not to impress others, but to hear the whisper of your own soul. You forgive yourself for who you thought you had to be. You hold space for the mess you once tried to hide, and you begin to understand that every version of you, even the fractured, even the afraid, is a valid chapter in your unfolding. There is nothing to prove anymore. The proof is in your aliveness, in your breath, in your choice to remain present when disappearing might have been easier, in your capacity to begin again, not because you failed, but because you are evolving. This is not weakness, it is devotion to truth, to soul, to the luminous mystery of your becoming. And so you walk, not toward a finish line, but within a field of presence. You walk with gentleness, with reverence, with the knowing that there is no right way to be, there is only your way. And that finally is enough.